dude, this thing with Russia is just like the craziest thing in the world. Like the idea that we're actually flirting with a nuclear conflict with Russia is the most important priority in the history of humanity. Is that there's two things like involving Ukraine, and one is that our last president was impeached over a thing with Ukraine. And then the other thing is current president's son was getting paid millions of dollars from a company, Burisma, in Ukraine. And this is all like the context that led to Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine. So it's just a very complicated mess. And it's the same thing with like the war on terrorism. If you're gonna tell this story of like what led to this, to understand where to go from here, the story has to include that is the most important priority in the history of humanity is that America and Russia do not go to war. There's nothing more important than that. That's it. We'll destroy the human species if we do this. And yet there's this war right on Russia's border, and there's no effort to negotiate going on. There's like no effort. In fact, from very solid reporting that actually America, through Boris Johnson, told Ukraine not to negotiate with Russia at the very beginning of the war when they had a deal worked out. They had a deal worked out. There's been reported in multiple sources that they had a deal worked out, and the deal was basically that Vladimir Putin would pull back. He would pull back his troops and leave Ukraine under the condition that the very simple conditions that Ukraine guaranteed autonomy for the Donbass region and agreed to never join NATO. And like that was a deal. Like, okay, I'm not saying everyone thinks that's the perfect deal, but it's better than what we got right now.
It's better than nuclear war.
And the official narrative, Joe, is basically Vladimir Putin is a madman, a crazy war criminal who's hell-bent on reforming the Soviet Union, and this is a real threat that he could do this, but also he's getting humiliated in this war in Ukraine. But when he says he's going to use nuclear weapons, don't listen to that. He'd never actually do that, even though he's a complete madman. And as everyone says, this war, the word they use over and over and over again, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton, all of them, unprovoked. Vladimir Putin led an unprovoked war in Ukraine. But then, it's just like with Osama bin Laden, what they did with him then. Don't listen to him. Whatever you do, don't listen to what he's actually saying, because none of that's his motivations. Like, what his motivations are what we tell you. Osama bin Laden hates us because we're free. Like, Osama bin Laden was so clear about why he hated America. And he's like, look, I hate you because you murder innocent civilians in the Muslim world, you prop up brutal dictators in the Muslim world, you prop up Israel, who mistreats the Palestinian people, and you have your bases in our Holy Land in the Arabian Peninsula. And then they're like, nah, he hates us because we're free. Like, he didn't mention anything about freedom there. And then if you say that, they're like, well, are you defending Osama bin Laden? And you're like, no, I'm just saying listen to your enemies. There's a reason why he hates us. And if you listen to Vladimir Putin and what he's saying, I mean, look, he's wrong for invading Ukraine. And there's no excuse for that. And like tens of thousands of people have died. It's horrible. And a lot of them are soldiers, but a lot of them are civilians. But to say he was unprovoked is like insane. It's just only people who know nothing about the history of this conflict would say there was no provocation.
Did you see the conversation that Roger Waters had with that CNN guy?
Yeah, and right, because Roger Waters was awesome on that. Because he knows what he's talking about, dude. And he's right about all of that shit. Look, the promise, and this is what he was saying, and he's absolutely right, is that the promise when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and this was like verbally promised and put in writing, was that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. And NATO at that point, the line then was through Germany. Right? Like the western half of Germany was in the west and the eastern half was with the Soviet Union. And they were like, we'll let all of these nations, secede and the Soviet Union will collapse and we're giving up on communism. It was one of the greatest things that ever happened. And the deal was, okay, you do that, then we won't move NATO. We won't move our military alliance into your area that used to be your realm of influence. And every single president since then has moved NATO east to the point that NATO is now on Russia's border. And in Ukraine, even though they didn't officially join NATO, there was always talk of it. Kamala Harris, right before the start of the war, said we're looking to put Ukraine into NATO. You know, they put under George W. Bush, they put in Poland these dual-use rocket launchers. There's a big complaint that Vladimir Putin has, that he's like, these can be used to get nukes here in a matter of minutes. Like this is like a threat to us that we cannot tolerate. And then in 2014, there was a coup in Ukraine that was completely led by the West. All these George Soros-funded NGOs were funding the militias on the ground who were overthrowing the government. And then there's a tape of Victoria Nuland, who's was at the State Department at the time, one of the top people at the State Department, and she was basically talking about who would be the new government that took over, who America didn't want in, who we did want in the new government. So it's not, what happened basically was the Ukrainian government was kind of siding with Russia, or at least a lot more pro-Russia. And then we overthrew that government and installed a pro-America government. And this to Putin, he had said over and over again, was a huge red line for him. Like Ukraine was the big line. And you could imagine, take it from our point of view, if like Russia was coming over here and overthrowing the pro-America government in Montreal and installing a pro-Russia government there. Right. And, this would be seen as, would you call that an unprovoked attack? So again, I'm not justifying what he's doing, and then the other thing to this, right, that's important to add is you remember the two big things that it's so weird, no one, larger conversation, I don't see anyone connecting these things, is that there's two things involving Ukraine that were very big, that happened very recently in American history, that very much connect to this war. And one is that our last president was impeached over a thing with Ukraine. And what was that? And then the other thing is the current president's son was getting paid millions of dollars from a company, Burisma, in Ukraine. And these things all connect. And basically what happened was, after the 2014 coup, Burisma was in bed with the old government that had allied with Russia. And so when this government was overthrown, they were very worried, because they were like, oh, we were in bed with the old government, and now there's this new government who's in there. And so instead of bribing the new government, they just went right to the source and bribed the son of the sitting vice president. Joe Biden, when he was vice president, was in charge of Ukraine policy. They're just paying him money to just be like, hey, keep us in with you. And then Trump was telling them to investigate all of this shit. He got on the phone with them and was like, I want to investigate everything that was going on with Joe and Hunter Biden in Ukraine. But then the other story about that is that ultimately Trump caved and he sent in the weapons to Ukraine. So now, not only did Obama overthrow the regime when Joe Biden was the point man, Joe Biden was running Ukraine policy, Obama leads this coup, overthrows that government and puts in a pro-Western government. Then Trump comes in, sends in a whole bunch of weapons to this new government that Obama wouldn't even send in because he was concerned it would provoke Russia. And then the next president is Joe Biden, the last guy who was the point man on Ukraine, who was there when this coup happened. Then he comes back in. And this is all the context that led to Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine. Donbass region on the eastern portion of Ukraine is majority ethnic Russians. And they got really pissed off when the new government came in 2014, and they were basically warring with Kiev, western portion of Ukraine, since then. And they had a referendum in 2015 and voted overwhelmingly that they wanted to be a part of Russia. And Vladimir Putin didn't take them, but they voted that they wanted to be part of Russia, not a part of Ukraine. So it's just a very complicated mess, and it's the same thing with the war on terrorism. If you're going to tell this story of what led to this, to understand where to go from here, the story has to include that America was intervening in the Middle East for decades before 9/11. The story can't just start at 9/11. You know what I mean? And so I guess the biggest part is what I said before, that the concern of all of us should be just that there's no nuclear conflict between America and Russia, which seems like we're dangerously close to.